Yeah, hi folks. I'm gonna set Brian up. Evan Manvel, climate mitigation planner again, he, him pronouns. I work at the state of Oregon, and Oregon is unique in the US as having a strong land use planning agency and a long culture of having a state role in land use planning. So that's why I'm here. In 2020, our then governor directed us to do more to meet our climate pollution reduction goals. And one of the things we did as an agency is we asked more out of our metro area cities and counties, including requiring them to reform parking. So when you look at that PRN mandates map, there's a reason we're punching way above our weight on that. We have 23 cities now, cities and counties that now have no mandates, roughly jurisdiction wide. And that's because our state agency stepped in and did that. When we did that, we knew that cities would have even more desire to figure out what comes next without parking mandates. How do we manage parking? How do we manage spillover effects? That sort of thing. It's a constant issue, regardless of whether people have mandates or not. But we wanted to say, hey, we know that people are going to be asking. So let's create some tools for you. Let's bring examples from around Oregon. Let's bring best practices in meeting cities, everything from 1,000 people up to the city of Portland at 660,000-ish, and say, here are some tools. Here's how to manage that parking. Here's how to efficiently create great cities, a positive parking experience for people, because we know that those local governments are going to be hearing complaints about parking. So we're trying to make sure that they know how best to do it. We asked for bids, and we were thrilled to have Brian Davis, who we've worked with before on some parking reforms and management plans around the state, bid, and we hired him to develop this. And we appreciate everyone who participated in reviewing that as we go. And we published it. Printed copies are sitting at my office as of today, but most people have the online version, and that'll be shared. So with that, I'm thrilled to pass it over to Brian Davis.
Great. Thank you for that unnecessarily, probably fictitiously generous introduction, but we'll take it. Yeah, so the Parking Management Jumpstart Guide, I usually do not launch into this level of detail. I usually kind of try and keep it at a high level, but you are my people, so we are going to dive right into it today. Does anyone recognize this equation, either from Professor Shoup's book or your introductory level planning classes or anything like that? Now is try to put my teaching hat on these online Zooms and monitor the chat and keep it active and encourage and foster a discussion. But if you are racking your brain wondering where it came from, it is because it has nothing to do with parking management. Of course, that is the rocket equation, and I like to show that to highlight the fact that we are not talking about rocket science here when we talk about parking management. What we're really trying to do are, it's a fairly simple thing that I can distill down sort of blithely into 3 steps here. Number 1 is identify where and when the problem is. Number 2 is identify where and when the problem isn't. And number 3, this is the tricky one, you have to figure out how to move demand from where the problem is to where the problem isn't. As not to say that there is not nuance in some of those steps. Certainly, obviously, in the third one, there's a ton of nuance, but it is to say that it's, a fairly simple, straightforward process of, a fairly simple logical flow we're working with here. So let's dive into that. How do we identify where the problem is, where it isn't, and most importantly, how to move demand? And this is where I am super fortunate to have been working under Evan in creating this. Evan, as a lot of you have worked with him in PRN know, has a number of superpowers, not the least of which is his power of naming things. You're probably familiar with his greatest hit, in my mind, what we all used to blandly call parking minimums or something like that. is now, and it just kind of rolls off the tongue. Say it with me: costly parking mandates. Um, I'm here to introduce you to his, I suppose, his Californication. Although presumably he was not in rehab when he thought of this. We'll leave that to the imagination. Uh, the parking management journey. And I really love this framework, and it's something that I think has caught on, which is to say that cities, as they grow, as they evolve, as they densify, as they age, as they fill in, they tend to experience they tend to experience similar pain points in certain orders, and they tend to respond to those in certain ways. Um, so yeah, Evan coined this term, the parking management journey, and kind of gave me the marching orders of, okay, so explore that, kind of figure out, what comes first, what comes next, what are some tools that can be used to address these parking issues, and how they're generally felt in the context they're generally felt, and that sort of thing. And so that was essentially the plot device for this guide here. What are some of the pain points? What are the symptoms? How are cities experiencing them? And what are they doing in response to them? And I'm going to take you through some of the things here, or rather than a full kind of synopsis, which isn't really going to be possible. And maybe, I don't feel like I have to convince you all why parking meters are a good thing, the way we maybe do with some of the smaller jurisdictions in Oregon. So instead, I just want to tell you about some of the things that I'm really proud of in this guide here. One of which is, this is something I haven't really seen a ton before outside of the work that you all in the Parking Reform Network rather, have produced. There's not a lot of guidance out there in terms of talking about parking. And trust me when I say there are mistakes that can be made if you go in without knowing what you're doing. So I tend to preach a very, and this is sort of in response to the way the field of planning is evolving generally. I think over the last several years, certainly people are expecting to, have a little bit more say in their plans rather than the top-down way of planning that we've historically done things in the field. That's true in, development, I think. And that's true in kind of master planning and that sort of thing. And I think it's true in parking planning. People really want to be involved. They want to be heard throughout the process. So we preach that. We preach that you should lead with outreach. And further, I preach sort of somewhere between a cynical and idealistic implementation of the Socratic method. I love this quote: "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." Believe me, understand when you go in front of a stakeholder advisory committee, if you think you know anything, they're going to shoot holes in that very quickly. So we kind of give some practical advice on that. Don't try to argue or persuade. Ask open questions and consider comments that don't align perfectly with the data as context, rather than one thing I actually said before at a Portland Shoepistas event. I'm dating myself, but back in 2016, we did an open house in Portland, a wonk night in Portland, and I said part of my job was to call bullshit where people said there was a parking problem and there wasn't one. I, I have since learned the error of my ways through through trying to argue that there wasn't a parking problem, where people are just darn sure that there is one, and it's best to just, yeah, okay, you say there's a problem there. I'm not seeing it in the data. There's something the data is missing. I'm missing some kind of context or whatever. So we talk about how to frame the conversation. Again, I'm uniquely qualified, I think, to write this because I've made every mistake in talking about parking in front of a planning commission or city commission that can be made. So and part of what we're trying to do with this whole guide is to make sure we're not treating parking management in a vacuum, but all of these things impact, the entire network of the city. So I want to make sure we're tying our broader planning goals into our parking management. So don't ask if parking is hard to find, ask when it's hard to find. It's not always going to be hard to find. It's not always going to be easy. Think about, how parking, what's your view of the role of parking in supporting the downtown or neighborhood? Things like that. Ask big picture questions, ask open-ended questions, let people kind of air their grievances, and then eventually they're going to wind up coming around to to some positions that make a lot of sense if you talk to them about it like they're grown-ups. That's one of my biggest takeaways in doing this work for quite a long time, is when you do talk to people about the trade-offs in parking, even though it's an emotional issue for a lot of people, they understand. They understand there's no such thing as a free lunch, and they understand there's no such thing as a free parking space. So yeah, we tried to make sure that our management measures covered the gamut from, the small town in Oregon or in your state or whatever that just has a little bit of a parking problem that's just experienced a few times a day or a few times a week in their small little downtown area, to our biggest city is Portland, but to the big cities with the big parking issues. So we kind of start with things like signage. Things like wayfinding signage, signage identifying parking lots, and those sorts of things. This is something that I think a lot of smaller towns could kind of do immediately and make whatever their nation parking problem is a lot better in a pretty big hurry. I love to use examples from Grants Pass, Oregon. You see that there are these signs from the right are from Grants Pass, as well as this one in the lower right. They have done a fantastic job in naming their parking lots, getting the signage to be consistent with the city's branding. And in fact, even the names, the city's branding, the city's reputation is very much based on the outdoor experience. And so the parking lots are all named for local flora and fauna to kind of just enhance that image a little bit more. It does a few things. It serves as affirmation for visitors. This is where they should be parking. This is, legal, appropriate parking. It gives them a landmark to recognize or to remember where their car is. So if they're not familiar with town, they can find their car at the end of the day. And it just really helps to identify resources and yeah, get the most out of these little public lots that a lot of times are on the outskirts of downtowns, but underutilized because people aren't finding them. So we go all the way from from parking or from parking signage, rather, maybe the first thing you could do, to parking benefit districts. At one point I called this the Cadillac of parking management solutions, but that feels kind of passe, both in terms of Cadillacs and naming it after cars. I also don't have a strong opinion on whether Cadillacs are very good or not. So something I'm much more knowledgeable and aware of, opinionated about. I'm now calling this the 1957 Fender Stratocaster of parking management solutions. Why? It's a perfect analogy. It's got the best pickups, the best fretboard, the best tuners, and the most resonant bodywood. And in fact, the parking benefit district is exactly that in a parking management solution. You kind of take the idea of right pricing. You put that into a package where you are going, again, from the ground up, where you're giving a group of an advisory committee say in how this money is being spent. You are funneling the money back into the district, which builds support for the money which builds support for the pricing in the first place. And also, they can do excellent things with the revenues they raise. So we talk a lot about parking benefit districts and how you would implement those in a variety of contexts, and how you tie in your parking benefit district with your, the rest of what's going on with your planning initiatives in your city. That'll bring me to the second thing. The next thing I'm super proud of. We have in this guide attempted to talk about the implications, the economic implications, the placemaking implications, the transportation system implications, and all of the above with regard to the management strategies you can employ and how you employ them, and what some of the synergies are when you employ them in concert with other strategies and that sort of thing. An example of this is something that, took a lot of conversation, a lot of outreach, and a lot of research to come up with a fairly simple bullet pointed list here. But I think it's a great example of how we tried to tie these management strategies to the planning context. When you set your time limits, why do you set them where they are? And what would be a better idea? What would be an appropriate time limit if you want to accommodate, say, some short duration trips, but you don't want, shift workers to be able to park their whole shift at a particular stall? When you want to just hasten turnover, or maximize turnover, or maybe maximize the number of stall hours. There's a analytical concept I'm fascinated with. Stall hours occupied. How often is a particular stall occupied over the course of a day, for how many hours? Yeah, how does this impact the economics, the ability of merchants to compete, the abilities of employers to employ? We tried to get into that to the extent that we could, with all of the management strategies we recommend here, and in particular these. Yeah, I'm pretty proud of this work that we did to kind of quantify how the various time limits impact things, and this is something that seems like it has resonance, yeah, around Oregon and beyond as well. We told the story of metering, and including an abbreviated version of one of my absolute favorite stories to tell, the story of Carl McGee. There is finally a biography by Jack McElroy. This came out in the middle of last year, Citizen Carl. I'm only 15 pages in, although I highly recommend it because this is a fascinating individual. He started out his career in Albuquerque as a muckraking journalist, where his work was credited with breaking the Teapot Dome scandal. Sounds rather quaint by today's standards, but 100 years ago, the Teapot Dome scandal was the biggest scandal in our history. I think that's fair to say. His muckraking ways eventually won him several convictions for libel, which the governor of New Mexico pardoned him for. However, he still found the judge that convicted him of yeah, the libel charges or slander, I forget what it was, in a hotel in Las Vegas one day. They got into a fight. Carlton McGee pulled his piece, shot and killed an innocent bystander, injured the judge, finally decided to get while the getting was good, so he went to Oklahoma City, where he was charged with solving an interesting parking problem. um, in Oklahoma City, they discovered an oil field. Very quickly, oil-based businesses sprung up in downtown, and those employees got to downtown earlier than the merchants, earlier than the merchants' customers, and thus took up all of the best parking. Um, Carl McGee invented a little gadget that charged per time and put up a flag when your time was up, and that became the modern parking meter. It became an instant hit. They piloted it on one side of the street. 3 days later, the merchants that did not have it were clamoring for it. And parking meters were installed on both sides of the street. Several years later, I think 3 or 4 years later, they came to Oregon. They were in New York City shortly after. They were in Oklahoma City, but we had what is still the best and most effective tool at managing parking on our hands, with the parking meter or some sort of revenue collection per unit time. Um, the the reason I bring this up, number one, is because it's fascinating that the guy who cracked the Teapot Dome scandal invented the parking meter. That's my fun fact at parties. I'm great at parties. Invite me to yours. But the other one, and more serious one, is literally every single town I've worked with has experienced to some extent this Oklahoma City problem, where employees, especially, there's also the residential context, which we mostly manage with permits. I'm kind of glossing over that in this presentation, but in the downtown mixed use context, this is how a lot of parking problems originate. Employees in unmanaged context, excuse me, employees, because they're the first people to arrive, they have their pick of the parking spaces. They also stay the longest, so they disproportionately impact things when they do park. So the first thing a lot of jurisdictions have to think about when they implement a parking plan is what to do about the employee parking. Typically, you do a carrot of some sort. You have a permit program or a dedicated space for them. Then you have the stick, which is the time limit or the meter. Voila, parking problem solved. And essentially, it's not that much more complicated than that. So we tell the story about that. Newport, Oregon, a little town of about 25,000 on the Oregon coast that has what I call a working bayfront, what they call a working bayfront. My introduction to the term. There's a lot of tourism demand there. There's a fish packing industry there. There is a fishing industry there. And all of those streams of demand cross over and overlap in some very interesting ways. And so we talk about that in the guide. We talked about that in doing a management plan for them. And at the end of the day, at the beginning of this parking plan, we were talking about, believe it or not, building a parking garage over the Newport Bay. Why over the Newport Bay? Two reasons. Number one, no buildable land. Number two, there were actually some grants that the city identified that could be used to fund construction of that. But a lot of times when you consider the question of, do we increase supply or do we price things? At the beginning of those conversations, sentiment is often very strongly in the increased supply corner. And then as soon as we start looking at numbers, it's amazing how fast that sentiment changes. That's exactly what happened in Newport. And it it took a while. It took a good 8 years, I think, of analysis and public outreach and that sort of thing. But they, in the summer of 2024, implemented parking meters for the first time, and early returns seem to be that it's working. So fun story that we go into there. We also talk about enforcement and how that fits. Let me check time here. Yeah, I should probably wrap it up. Enforcement is something, this is a little bit of a white whale for jurisdictions. No one can really figure out the best way to do it, especially if you don't have meters. It's something that typically is a revenue drain, but then if you don't do it, your other management suffers. So we talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about the various approaches, the way things can do it, and importantly, the way some new technological innovations are giving cities the power to do things that they didn't have, even as recently as before the pandemic. There are a lot of packages that all just kind of fit together in terms of management and enforcement and those sorts of things. We take a detailed look at the city of Bend, Oregon, and what they're doing. They're certainly Oregon's most fashion forward city, I guess, in terms of rolling out a suite of technology. They don't have paid parking yet, at least on the street, but they're using the technology in various ways to establish whether or not that's needed. But they're doing some very neat stuff in terms of management and wayfinding and analysis with their with a lot of their parking new. And that's the other thing I wanted to point out. This is something that really worries me. I'll kind of close things on this note. As the technology evolves, and it evolves fast, most jurisdictions aren't making this mistake yet, and I hope we continue to not make the mistake of the technology is a solution in a vacuum. One thing I want to make really clear is that the technology needs to be supporting a plan, and that plan has to be kind of based on sort of the fundamentals. And these are not complex fundamentals, but they kind of do need to be, acknowledged and adhered to. Essentially we're trying to manage to an optimal demand level, which is not too high, not too low. And we have to be rolling out a smart suite of tools to use that. And the technology is one of those tools, but not a replacement for those tools. So yeah, the supporting materials, I think they put the link there. Don't want to talk too much about these. We'll demo them if we run out of conversation or whatever. But by all means, go to the link, play with them yourself. We have some fun tools for collecting data, including occupancy data, turnover data, marrying your turnover data and occupancy data into a GIS layer, and how to figure out what meters are going to cost up front, which are going to gain from revenue over the course of it, those sorts of things. We have worksheets for all of that. And I'm obsessed with communication and where that's going. And I think one of the funnest new promising tools for communicating and planning is story maps. And so we have a synopsis of the guide as a story map too on DLCD's website. So I hope you do check those out. And on that, I guess we'll pitch it back to Evan and open up for questions.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate that. It's hard to cover everything that's in the guide, but that's why we have printed versions and the online thing. A couple of quick notes about it in case people weren't noting that tool at the end. There was a context button, so you kind of say, "Oh, I'm kind of like this city in this area," and then it changes the demand map based on actual data use or occupancy turnover data. And the other thing is we really strove to create stories because local governments, both decision makers and planners, want to hear how another city's done it. And so we have a variety of case studies throughout the guide that you can find on the story map, and really try to integrate that in because people want to imagine something on the ground as much as all of us love to read Dr. Shoops and others hefty data driven things. Not everyone has the time to find the delightful stories in that book. So we tried to get some other things. There are a couple of questions in the chat. If people want to enter other questions in the chat, great. There was a quick question on whether any of the Newport meter revenue was going back to businesses, and I don't believe that's the case, but Brian, do you know?
I'm not actually sure. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I think there are PBD elements, but yeah, back directly to businesses, I don't believe so.
Yeah, great.
That's an interesting, and I'm not sure of anyone that's doing that, but it's an interesting thing to do if, yeah, if all of the other PBD elements is not
Yeah.
sufficient to get support for metered parking, maybe try. I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah, certainly here in Salem, we're moving from a fee that businesses are paying to meters. So that's giving money back to the businesses by avoiding that fee. But there's a question about whether the tool works outside the US. Brian?
Yeah, but in the other English speaking countries, you just have to read it backwards. Yeah, I that's a good question. I personally don't have any experience with parking management outside the US or even parking outside the US. But I believe these are universal kinds of planning principles that we've kind of chased down here. So I I would hope it would. By all means, kind of bring it up, follow it, see if it gains any traction, and let us know.
Yeah, wonderful. Zevi, I see your hand up. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it.
Svi, thank you very much. So thank you so much for sharing this amazing work. It's really impressive. I find in the US, most of the conversation is always about proper pricing of parking and managing the availability. And I actually did my PhD research in those areas. And my thinking has come to evolve a bit to it's really how we structure parking, which has the most impact. Like not necessarily having less parking, but fewer options. Like in a small town context, for example, having, concentrated parking at, the respective ends of the main street, for example. So I'm just curious if your tool provides any ways to analyze that kind of a scenario, and if you have any experience in thinking about it. Like it's not the overall amount of parking, but it's really how we structure it. So thank you.
Yeah, so I assume you're talking about the relatively common scenario, unfortunately, where you have a downtown and there's 10 different buildings and they each have their own parking lot and they're each 25% full all the time. And then there's no place to park because the one block of on-street parking is totally full. Yeah, so and that's exactly sort of what I was trying to get at big picture when I talk about going from thinking about parking in a vacuum to thinking about parking in a big picture context. I agree pretty wholeheartedly that it would be ideal to replace this, this hypothetical city with, each building with its own parking lot with, one parking lot where everyone can park, and then you walk to each of the different businesses there. And that's probably the high-end planning goal of most of the cities that I've worked with, at least the small cities that are, that are hiring me to do parking plans for their downtowns. Get away from this, single-use parking lot, and park once and walk is the model that they want to kind of push there. Yeah, absolutely. This, the ideal way to do that would be, frankly, to bulldoze the city and start over. But yeah, it's very complex going from where we are now to there, oftentimes because you have some uses that, that are very willing to do shared parking agreements and that sort of thing. But you have other uses, banks, for instance, just famously don't want to get into, they always have big parking lots. None of them have been very well occupied since the 90s at this juncture, but they're just reluctant to do any kind of shared parking. So we're left to wait until they redevelop.
Do you think tax policies could nudge the way these kind of commerces treat that space? Like if we taxed it at a higher rate for the parking, is right now it's like considered non-development and it's pretty marginal. Like if they actually had to pay the opportunity cost to use it more effectively, could that change the incentives?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if there's a, oh, sorry, my phone is ringing. I thought I had on do not disturb. I apologize. Yeah, if there's any way tax policy would be a good way. I mean, that's I think a big problem is other than, the opportunity cost, they don't, a lot of that underused parking, isn't really, there's and it's an interesting example. It gets worse as the parking space gets bigger, right? The big box stores would quite often intentionally oversize their parking spaces because or parking lots, because the impression of ample abundant free parking is more than enough to make up for the small incremental cost of the 102nd and 103rd and 104th space. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, but tax policy is kind of, I'm not sure if you have anything on that, Evan.
No, I would just say that we did some things in our parking policy reforms that were options for cities because we do think financial incentives are really key to meeting our goals, but a lot of that was outside of our authority. So we're like, hey, if you don't want to totally repeal parking mandates, you do X and Y and Z, and we'd love that. And people repealed their parking mandates generally. So certainly some taxes on parking lots and some other incentives to move some things are things we've considered. I do want to, there's another question from Andy in the chat about an approach or strategy that would apply to a community where all the parking demand issues are in a privately owned parking lot.
Where all of the supply is or all of the demand issues? I honestly, if it's all of the demand issues, it sounds more like a they problem than a city problem. And But that's not necessarily true because at that point the city is probably dealing with the impacts of the spillover parking and that sort of thing. I have a good example on that from Yachats, a problem that Evan and I, or a town that Evan and I worked together to do a parking plan for. They had not a ton of on-street supply or whatever, and not a big off-street resource or whatever. So the grocery store, what was the name of that grocery store? At C and something market, niche chain in the Oregon coast, that wound up absorbing a lot of the demand. And people, yeah, a lot of people complained about that. The only people that did not complain about that really were the owners of C and K Market, because they were more than happy to accommodate the parking. They thought they had enough in their lot, and they thought they were getting at least some of those people into their store at the beginning or the end of their the beginning or the end of their stay. So that was more of a problem as experienced by locals than it was for the company. And it also, and then when we, of course, did the data collection, was there high demand in that lot? Yeah. Was it ever too much above 85%? No, not even during a busy summer day. So, yeah, I guess my short answer to that question is, it's again, it's the same sort of is the same sort of approach that you take. Where is the problem? Where is the problem? How do we move it? You just have to kind of think carefully about the context of the private lot, how you as a community are impacted by that, where your responsibility is and isn't for managing that demand, and how the solutions there are going to impact things big picture outside of just that lot.